Let's just get started. We're already at 4:02. So firstly, thanks everyone for joining in on Saturday. We have an amazing guest today. Pritham is here. He's head of product at Postman. Before this, he's led product teams at Haptic, Cube26, Kotak Mahindra, built lots of scalable products. Super excited to learn about the B2B space. In the world where the stock market is volatile, venture is hard to get come by. B2B is definitely something that the B2C companies can learn from on how to think about revenue, how to think about building sustainable businesses. So I'm super excited. More than anything, I'm just excited to kind of get the questions that I am extremely curious about. So super looking forward to learning about that and seeing what we can apply it in the context of B2C. So just to get started, I'll also kind of introduce our thought process behind running the series. This is a growth series. The idea here is, the inception of the idea came from me wanting to talk to people, product leaders who are essentially solving hard problems, going very specific, where you can get some actionable insights. Those conversations ended up being interesting, and I realized that there are a lot of people that had similar questions. So why not use the same? Why not leverage the hour of time that I spend with them and make it accessible for more people? That's how we started Raise the Bar. We do this every alternate Saturdays. And the idea is to touch upon interesting topics that everyone has questions on. The goal is to go deep enough where you leave the session with something you can actually start implementing right away. So with that little introduction about myself, I'm Mona. I'm the founder at Upraised. Prior to this, I was at Airbnb for about 7 years. I started there as a first female engineer. I've always been at startups. This is my fifth one. And I love to be at the intersection of technology, people, and sort of consumers. So consumer tech is my thing. So I'm extremely excited about this because this is a new space that I'm very keen to learn about. So we're at 100 folks now. Let's get started. So Pritham, the first question I had, and I think this is a question that probably is probably one of the most asked questions, is what is the difference between B2B and B2C, especially when you think about product building and from a lens of a product manager?
Interesting question. I think before I go and segment and tell what I see is different in B2C and B2B, right? I think we need to I need to define what a PM generally does. So I think if you have that definition understanding, it's a lot more easier for me to decipher B2C. A product manager is someone who is responsible for creating long-term business impact, right? The primary objective for any PM in any organization is just figuring out how do I continuously create business impact over a period of time, and you're creating sustainable value, right? That's the primary job for any PM, whether someone's working on e-commerce or social media or a B2B product, right? And I remember our CEO recently, we were discussing about this, and he mentioned one of the models in which generally products are looked at, right? So the way that businesses generally run is you have acquisition, which is usually active users. Then you have a percentage of conversion from the active users who are going to convert into paying users. And then you have ARPU, which is the per revenue user, right? This translates to what your business outcome looks like. Now, the interesting bit is PMs generally are focusing on these three segments continuously on a day-to-day basis. Their primary job is to figure out, okay, how do I create a product which is super engaging, and there's a broader problem that it actually solves. The larger the use case, the better, because you can go ahead and get more and more users to use your product, right? Second thing people also concentrate on is converting a user who might or might not be interested into actually purchasing the product, right? The third aspect is how much can I charge what is the willingness to pay to the end user based on the value that you have created, right? And whether you're B2C and B2B, this is a primary focus for all of them. There's a percentage, maybe the concentration or the time effort put into each buckets are slightly different depending on which industry you work in. but it is generally this simple principle that's there across the board, right? Now, if you had asked this question 10 years ago, for B2B space, I would have given a very different answer.
What would have that answer been? I'm curious.
Yeah, so like in B2B space, like 10, even if you go 15 years ago, right? So SaaS was not a thing. SaaS was something that was just picking up. Cloud was definitely not a thing. Not a lot of companies were willing to use cloud or any cloud-based product, right? So essentially, the whole motion used to run on I spoke about these three things, which is that active user, conversion, and value creation. There's ARPU, right? Just to pay is the only thing the PM could influence, because they could not have any other lever in actually creating active users in the bucket, because it was solely reliant on a salesperson or a marketing person getting the right segment of users, right? So because every user acquisition would rely on a salesperson going to that said organization or said business and pitching the idea and getting that person to buy the product. And then is when the product manager's capability of building a product, right? Now, B2C, this is not always like B2C is like the whole broad thing is always there, right? Because you're always selling to each individual user. So you have this full freedom to go across the spectrum.
Correct.
Now, I think last 10 years it's changed a lot, right? One, obviously I spoke about cloud being generally more acceptable as a way, because like we see in our own general companies, right? Even you as a founder, you would see you will be using a lot of SaaS products now.
Correct.
Right. And in the last couple of years, I think this is like what is now termed as product-led growth, right? That has picked up a lot of momentum, which was not there previously, right? Now, that has also introduced that first segment into the product manager scope in B2B, where you have to figure out how do I solve a large-scale problem and I engage in product, right? Which is not a necessity before.
Yeah, this is actually a good segue into the next question which I had, which is in the B2B world, how do you actually even identify what are problems worth solving, right? Because they seem like a very, for example, let's take Postman. It comes from very much like, I'm an engineer and as I work with other engineers, I constantly face this challenge of, building APIs that I can't test. There are, dev cycles that go to waste because there's just a back and forth on like, how do I, where is it breaking? Why is it not working? So on and so forth. So how do you even identify what are good problems to solve?
So the interesting bit here is also very different to a B2C space, right? Because in a B2B space, the person who is generally going to purchase a product, it's not the person who's going to use the product, right? So there's this like different persona that you need to set.
Yes.
And when you're identifying the problem that you want to solve for, one is you have to understand the importance of the problem for the business. If I were to go solve this problem, what impact does it have on the business of the user who's going to purchase it, right? So that impact is something that you need to align towards. If not, then you can always have a free product which has a large amount of adoption, but no one will be willing to pay for it, because the person who is willing to pay for it has no buy-in to do this, right? For Postman specifically, I can take a good example, right? Now, Postman is a tool which generally enables you to build APIs faster and better, right? Now, when you go and talk to the person who's going to pay it can be an engineering manager, a BP, a CXO, right? Their concern is how do I get my developer productivity faster?
Correct.
How do I ensure I can ship products faster so that I have a business impact, right? As long as you're not solving for that problem, right? It's generally not something that is valuable.
Absolutely. And which is why it is so interesting, in the B2C space, typically the thought process you would follow is, hey, I have the problem myself. I'm a consumer. Can I find more people like me who have the same problem who would pay for this? And because the problem starts with me, it's much easier to internalize what the problem is. And it's much easier to identify how you can add value. And then it's also much easier for you to test, because you can find people like you in a small audience, give that solution and get feedback very quickly. How does that work in the B2B world?
The interesting bit is like, I think this is what I was thinking on the way that we operate in different companies is also very different, right? In the B2C space, the user research that you do, like when you go ahead and want to build a product, solve a problem, right? There's this volume problem. You will go and try to solve 90% of the problem. That's generally the principle everywhere. You can't solve 100%, right? You'll try to figure out what is the primary use case and try to solve for it, right? And in B2C, the general topics are more relatable. Like if for example, you work in Airbnb, travel is something you can really totally relate to, right? Like makes sense. I know people who are traveling, I can go talk to them, right? In a B2B space, I think the criticality of how successful a PM can be depends on how passionate they are about the problem space. I'm not even talking about a solution or what, right? If they are really passionate about solving that problem and actually see that as a problem, right, then it gives you a lot of insights and looking at it objectively, and then you have to go that extra mile to get that information, right? User research, one of the reasons why user research is really, really important from a PM skill set when it comes to a B2B space is because of this. Because you have to talk to customers, you have to talk to users, you have to put in that extra mile effort to go reach out and then ask that really, really pointed questions which give you an objective answer. That is really hard. Surveys are really bad thing to do on a B2B space because surveys don't give you much insights, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Walk us through the early days of Postman. Like how did you iterate on it to becoming where it is what it is today?
I think the actually segue in what you mentioned before, right? I think it's very easy to relate to. Our founders, both Abhinav and Ankit, so the way that they met was in Yahoo. So Abhinav at that time was an intern at Yahoo, and Ankit was already an engineer there. So they both were working on building this front-end application for Yahoo, right? That was their primary job. What would essentially happen is every week there would be a new deployment on a service somewhere, and it would break the UI, right? And everyone would point out to these guys, say, "Why don't you go fix it?" Right? Now, yeah. So that used to happen on a weekly basis. That's where they felt the pain of APIs. Right? Oh, okay, I don't know how to use it. This is really causing a lot of pain. How do I start figuring it out, right? So when Abhinav was working on a first startup that he was working in, right? He was a CTO there. So at that point of time, he was ideating of this. Okay, this is a problem that is big enough. Let me try to build a tool. And I think in 2013, 2014 is the first post on Stack Overflow where Abhinav was like, hey, you know what? I built this product. This will solve this problem for you. Why don't you try it out, right? Very interesting bit is before we actually incorporated, we had more than 500k users, right? Even before we were actual company, we had 500k users using the application, right? For us, that was like a
wow,
massive.
And these are 500k developers.
Yeah, so they were using it for this testing. Because I remember this joke that Ankit had told me was, when we actually mapped, we had Google Analytics where you could see the map of all the users, right? The first time that we were evaluating and looking at what do we build or how much of a use case is this, right? Apart from Antarctica, there were users in every single country.
Amazing. Oh my God. That's like dream come true.
Yeah. So yeah, different. So I think for us, the product value creation and validation was there. It is more challenging was figuring out the business model and how do you build it, right? Because 7 years ago, there was no one dev tools being monetized was not there, right? Okay. And now collaboration on tools are generally seen everywhere, right?
Yes.
And collaboration as a business model also did not exist, right? So you are going into this space where yes, you have a lot of usage and engagement because users find your product really useful. But does that translate into a long-term business was something that we as a company have continuously iterated on for the last 7 to 8 years, and that we continue to do it, right? So there's we always focus on those 3 models that I spoke about, and that's how we generate value.
Fantastic. Especially at Postman, what is the role of the sales and the marketing team in the product roadmap? How does that influence the product roadmap?
Yeah, I think the interesting bit is we actually are a very good case study for product-led growth for a long period of time, right? For almost till about 4 years ago, I think 3 years ago, right? We did not have, even 2.5, 3 years ago, we did not have a salesperson, right, in the whole org, even though we were making money by then, right? We had a decent amount of revenue and we were decently net in the amount of that we spend to versus what we used to invest for R&D, what we used to earn, right? We did not need a sales team because the product itself could sell and we had a good amount of product growth motion running and that would support us, right? And marketing was more towards brand recognition, right? The impact that they had, as opposed to figuring out how do we sell the product. That was not something that even marketing had picked up till about 2 years ago. Right? So the way that I see it, in especially in the B2B space, even in Postman, right? Marketing and sales generally are these people who grease that wheel of motion, right? So they majorly concentrate on influencing a bit of conversions for higher ARPU. So you're like, how do you go and spend that effort to push that extra mile so people can realize the value, which might take time in using the product and get to it, right? So if using a product for a year, then you realize the value, right? The topmost value. How do I short circuit that and actually bring it to within 2 weeks or 3 weeks? That's what marketing and sales generally play in Postman, right? And for a roadmap influence perspective, right? I think there's always this balance of figuring out what is long-term value versus what I call value creation versus value capture, right? So do you have the right tools to enable value capture, which is what sales and marketing generally both focus on, right? While a PM is supposed to focus on building value creation within the product.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, you didn't have a Salesforce until like 2.5 years ago. That's very, very recent. Yeah, that is like I feel like the last 2 years is just equivalent to 2 months because everything is just COVID. But tell me, can you do a little bit of a deep dive into, like you said, product-led growth, right? What does that mean in the case of Postman? Like, walk me through how things get in motion there.
I think like the product-led growth part, right? Like how do you influence the 3 sections? Like ARPU is what a core product value creation is focused on, right? So that is something that like everyone has to do on a general basis, right?
Yes.
So product-led growth are the 2 other segments that are there, which is like how do I create and reach out to more and more users, right? And secondly, how do I influence conversion, right? So the way that we like as a product we can go and enable this is you create like effective content loops or networks, right? The content loops is basically how do you find a use case which is not a single user use case, but try to expand it in a way that it generally you get your product adoption going, right? For us, the advantage is APIs in general are collaborative by definition.
Yeah.
They're created to be shared, right, with someone else.
Yes.
So if you build a really good product and you build something that's actually shareable really well, right, you will get adoption purely via product. You don't need to go sell, right? Even our current user acquisition, like number of people who sign up to Postman, we don't spend a lot of, actually we don't spend, we spend very, very little money in actually acquiring users, right? Because we don't have, the product itself is, if you build a really good product, it has a good loop set up already, what you call flywheel, right? And it just keeps supercharging really fast.
So I'm very curious, for a product, whose value is so inherent to developer productivity, it feels like developers obviously understand this value extremely well, right? Like they understand the problem statement very well, which is close to their heart. Why aren't there more developers that have built something like Postman? Or have they, and just Postman is better in some unique ways?
I think imitation is really good. So like the thing that I see is like whenever you see success, I am pretty sure 10 other similar to Postman, right? The interesting bit is when you look at developers as an ecosystem, right? It's an ecosystem which is very hard to please, right? It's like you cannot market to a developer, right? It's very, very hard. You cannot go sell something to a developer using marketing channels, standard marketing channels, right?
Correct.
Now, the focus for us has always been community first. So we always listen to our community and go figure out how do we solve that use case better. And we focus on experience, right? One of the standard things that people have generally accepted, at least like I had till the point of 2013, 14, right? I think most of the developer tools even I used to use previously, right? All of them were really bad. Like they would have bad UX, they would be really crappy to use or buggy to use, right? No one really gave a crap about how it's being used. That was generally not good, right? And building a really high experience product sometimes creates a good moat for you. It's
Right.
like Postman has always focused and like tried to do that, right? Like no matter what feature we add, we always try to think about how does it holistically make the developers a lot better. That I think R&D is our secret sauce.
Got it. And what is the role of a PM or the contribution of the PM in this R&D universe? I imagine that to be very significant.
Yeah, it's like something that's like really, really important, right? A product manager in Postman. I think the things like even which even reflects in the way that we interview and we want people to join, right? One is the specific skill set that you generally need as a PM, right? That's I think anyway, that's something you can learn and you can get out, right? The really important bit is someone who's really interested in solving this problem, because R&D will take time and what I call as compounding effect, right? I don't expect a product manager to join Postman and immediately come up with a roadmap for the next 1 year within the next 1 month, right? That's not going to happen. That's a given, right? I don't expect that to happen, right? But what we see is like a product manager that joins Postman takes about 6 months to figure out what are the right decisions, smaller scale decisions that work, right? Then invest in continuous R&D, which generally enables you to take better and better decisions over a period of time, right? And that is a compounding effect. So like more you spend time talking to your users, we have open issues on GitHub. We have a discourse community, which is there integrated into Slack, and we have support tickets, and PMs are actually in all these buckets. They go through this, understand that problem over and over again, have an in-depth understanding of what that pain looks like, right? And then go ahead and put it out, right? One interesting other thing that we did, which enabled PMs to focus this R&D space really well. I think other than few initial members that were there in Postman, I think when I joined, we were 15, 20 odd people, right? So that was a space where everybody should do everything. So you would have to know what that full domain looks like from, okay, how do you sign up into Postman to what are the things that you can build? These are different tools, how each of those tools solve a different problem. And then what does that enterprise sales motion look like? Right? So we went to this one phase where we spent time in designing domains within Postman. So a product manager generally looks at one specific domain. Let's say if I have to look at about API testing, right? A product manager spends a large amount of time on understanding what API testing workflows look like and what enables them. So like it's really significant effort that goes in, and the value is really important because a product manager, like I said, is someone who sits between users, business, and design. So if you cannot match all of them, right, then there is either going to be a bad product or unsellable product or really crappy design. I think you're muted.
Sorry, I was just typing. Building on that, can you articulate what are the skills required to be an effective PM at Postman or in the B2B world? Like,
I think the critical, really critical skill, right? There are few important skills that are required. One, the slightly, I would say, smaller chunk or not the super critical ones are actually building a super thinking about conversion, right? We don't really need PMs to think about that. The two critical parts that a PM needs to build is build an engaging product, right? And increasing ARPU. Now, increasing ARPU usually comes from value creation, and that is something that we encourage PMs at Postman to continuously understand. How much of a problem is it to the customer that you're trying to solve for, right? It is whether it is on a technical space or it is a user experience bit, right? Understanding, okay, this is the workflow of my customer, right? Or a developer or a team that functions. And this tool that I'm going to build or this new feature or this enhancement that I'm going to do to the product is to solve for that problem, right? That articulation as well as identifying the right problem is what is really important, right? And tools, the important, I think the interesting between here also, I think B2C, B2B slightly different, right? Where B2B products, especially like products like Postman, are behavior builders. You have to build behaviors and you have product which a user uses on a daily basis, right? Whereas in B2C, it's more towards a transaction, right? So you can actually change the button to different positions, right? And you can test it out, right? Like, hey, let me make this bigger, let me move this up, or like, right? B2C, like in a product like Postman, you can't do that very, very quickly because people have built workflows on how the UI looks like, what feature does, right? So like understanding that mindset is really critical. Because we get a lot of love and we also get a massive amount of hate when we screw up, right? Whenever we release a feature which people really don't like, we get to know about it in like 2 minutes. It's out in production. We get feedback on Twitter to the high sentiment of, okay, you have broken my life. You're like destroyed my weekend, destroyed my day. How can you do this for me? Right?
Yeah. What do you do then? Do you roll back like instantly, or like what do you do? How do you react to that?
We like, I think that is something like we immediately stop. Like we have built this muscle from early on, right? One of our co-founders, Abhijit Kane, right? The story of him, he used to like push out application every couple of hours. So you get a feedback like next application would be deployed and like, hey, this is fixed. Don't worry about that, right? So like that is instinctively built into our DNA where we react to our customers really well. And we, as much as possible, we prevent, right? I don't see as many as I used to see very, very early on into Postman, right? Because we put in a lot of effort into designing the right thing now. And we also have a lot more, I think, information or understanding of what, how things are used, right? Before we go break something and then like people will go come for our side.
Interesting. So, if you were to summarize, in the B2C world, there is this philosophy of move fast and break things. What is the equivalent of that in the B2B world?
I think like it is sort of translating, right? Move fast and break things is really good. But let's say in B2B world, initially, I think the 10-year story I told you about.
Yeah.
More in the sense of like, okay, you ship what you're 100% sure of. You cannot experiment. You have to ensure that it works really end to end. So what it usually is to translate into products being shipped every 1 year, or at best, the best of the best companies should ship 6 months. Right? I remember this one case study by Intuit where they were super happy that they eventually started shipping every quarter because they were initially shipping every year just before the tax time, right? Now the B2B space is how do you ship really fast, right, to get that value addition without breaking stuff? Because you are like here you are like really, really adhered to SLAs. You can't break those SLAs, right? So you have to build a really, really good engineering system, which is what we spend a large amount of time, right? I think so. I told you that we had about 22 people, 20, including me. I think we had 21 people when I joined Postman, right? Including the founders, other than Abhinav, who were like Abhijit and Ankit used to develop even then, right? We had 16 developers, 2 DevRel, and I think 2 marketing people, apart from me. That's it. But the major investment is always to go into engineering. To how do you build a really, really good product, right? And we don't want to build big buggy things.
Makes sense. Is this still the distribution today? Like, how is the team structured today?
I think the distribution even now is, I think 60-40, right? Engineering still occupies 50 to 60%. When I say engineering, product design and engineering, right? So they occupy about 60% of our total organization and 40% is the rest, right? Because the investment has to go into building better products and we can't take a risk there because that is our, like I said, it's our mode. How do you build a better experience product, right?
Makes sense. Actually, one of the things that I at Upraised, we are also a customer of Postman. We happily pay $90 every month. We love the product. And I imagine every startup to sort of be a consumer of this because you have limited dev resources. You want them to focus on building the core of your business rather than developer tools that add productivity, right? So one of the things that I've noticed about Postman on a constant basis is just the quality of the product and the quality of the experience, both of which you talked about a little bit. Curious, how do you guys evaluate PMs? Like, it has to be a fairly detailed process given the quality bar that you have, right? What are you looking for and how do you evaluate them?
I think it depends on the kind of PMs, right? One of the few success stories that we've had when it comes to any form of hiring, right? It's usually worked well where we had gotten either interns or early stage PMs and we actually go mentor them and scale them up, right? Now, the reason that it's generally successful is you need to have the raw ability, which I think every PM is generally needs to have, right? And then you need to have a structured thought process, right? And then you also need to have the passion for the space. Now,
Correct.
Evaluation is extremely tricky because we have to be really objective about this, because I know developers who wanted to be PMs, right? But even though they understand the developer workflow really well, because they cannot think objectively of how do you build a product, it generally becomes a challenge for most of the PMs there. Right? Then I have also spoken to PMs who have been generally really good PMs otherwise, right, in terms of skill set, but they have no inherent interest in actually solving the problem. So their solutions are going to be surface level. And a product, so our enterprise user base, right? For us, one enterprise license per month is $100, right? If you have to build a product that is worth $100 per month for a user, right? You need to understand the depth of value that will create, right? So we can't skim on that. If you think about just a surface level, right? You will build a product which is max worth $10. It's not going to scale beyond that. So that interest and that scaling is really important. And in general for PMs, especially at Postman, I keep this benchmark. Most of the PMs take about 6 months, even after we do hire, to come to a point where they are delivering value by coming up with ideas, right? Usually 3 months is actually, if someone is getting to that stage by 3 months is really great, right? But it usually takes anywhere between 3 to 6 months, right? First 3 months is going into investing. And that's the reason we look for culture fit, right? And interest in the domain and raw skills as a good PM.
How do you what is in the org structure in the B2B world? I'm curious if it's any different than the B2C world. What does the day in the life of a PM at Postman look like? What does your day look like?
Yeah, I think because I've been a PM, I'll tell when I was a PM what generally my day looked like. Right?
Yes.
Generally, because we are a startup, so slightly more not process oriented, so I'll get more organic answer there. So the most important thing that I used to wake up with, I used to reserve 30-40 minutes per day into looking at your data of what's happened as a trend over the last couple of days. Right? Your key metrics that you will define, which are your leading metrics, not necessarily lagging metric, because I don't really measure revenue. If something's wrong with my revenue, maybe I'll take a decision back 6 months ago. So you don't know the next day, right? So that's actually a very big difference between B2C and B2B. If you make a mistake today, you will know the next day.
Yes.
In B2B, you don't know that. You will know that 6 months later. Right. So the leading metric is really important. So spend time in understanding what the leading metrics are looking, right? Is that healthy and trendy, right? And actually I would spend about an hour going through user tickets and comments that have been happening on GitHub and general discussions on the product, right? This is very important because I think if I were to start from scratch to the thing that I know right now, if I were to research the whole thing, it will take me maybe 3 to 4 months of just pure research, right? But if you on a daily basis, this is what I do. Every day, if I spend an hour, I don't have to do this 3 months or 6 months research. Right? Then it's focusing on basically taking the right decisions for the product. So you go interact with what is being built, what you're ideating on, right? And validating that with the current product and then testing it out. Then you talk to customers, you talk to your own developers because we dog food heavily. So we have, like I said, 16 engineers. Now we have about 300 plus engineers, right? So when it gets deployed to Postman, you actually talk to our own engineers to, hey, you know what, this makes sense. So we get that continuous feedback from our own developers, even when they're building. That's also a good advantage we have because we build for ourselves.
Correct. How do you, is there anything in your dev cycle that changes when you build from India for the rest of the world? Is there any change in the thought process, the ambition, the kind of team you hire, or the processes that you have in place? Does any of that change?
I think it's generally the high bar that you set, right? It is something that we have learned and tried to inculcate into our engineering process from day zero, right? Even now, majority of engineers are actually in India, right? And I'm really proud of my engineering team in terms of the quality of the product that we ship, right? And from early on, like we have always concentrated on building a really, really well engineered product. Like I said, like the 500K number, right? When I joined, we had about, I think, 2.5 million users signed up. This is in 2017, right? And now we are 20. Now, for you to support that level of active users and users in your product, right? You have to really, really build a really great product. And one of the things that is different when you build a global product is products in many countries are not very forgiving. So the markets are not forgiving, right? If you have a bad experience product and if it is built that way, it is generally people do not treat it really well. That's a big difference in mentality, right? And I think that's like really, really important. The other aspect of it is understanding the workflows, which might be different in different segments. The ability to segment things and identifying the problems that you are trying to solve and how it addresses is really, really critical. Because whether it is how you charge people, how do you use some workflow, what are the compliance in certain countries are very different in varying different part of the company in countries, as well as different type of organizations. So if you are looking for a Postman, if it were to be used by a government body, right, they have a very different level of scrutiny and things. You need to understand that, right? So you need to adhere to it. That's the reason I said like the pass and break thing doesn't necessarily work, because if you are already signing a contract and you're expected to maintain a 99.9% SLA on availability, you can't bring systems down.
Yes, absolutely. You're in 2017, Postman was not as well known as it is today. And you were pitching to get the best PMs. What was your pitch then? And how has it changed now?
Actually, it's not changed a lot, because my pitch has never been about, hey, you know what, like this is a great brand, or we have this much amount of valuation.
Yeah.
Surprisingly, like I don't think we even released our valuation till about the last two years ago.
Yes.
We hadn't released what we are valued at, right? And the major pitch is to be like, for a product manager, right? What is the thing that generally makes you happy? If someone wants to focusing on like building great products and creating long-term impact in a product, right? And have that semi-autonomy to go and build it out in the right way, right? So that is what a PM in Postman gets to do. Now, the simplest pitch that I will say is usually in companies, when you join, there are usually like two types of problems. One is a scale problem, the other is a scaling problem, right? So if you join startups, you get the scaling problem. You're like, oh, okay, I'm moving really fast. Things are changing. How do I scale this? How do I get more people? How do I build a better product, right? And the second section is like, okay, you're in a scaled problem, right? So let's say if you're working in Google, let's say you're working in Airbnb now, right? So you have this massive scale problem. How do you figure out to ship things which are effective for millions of users, right? And Postman has always been in this intersection of both, because we are growing really fast, right? Both in terms of people and users, right? And we are already operating at a very high scale compared to most of the product exist. So the challenge, if any PM finds it really interesting to work on the two simultaneous problem, which is hard to find in this world, right? That is where the like Postman comes in value. You want to work on an interesting problem. You want to work on a complex problem, which is not very easy to crack. And then you also get the ability to work on the scale and scaling problem, right? Now, that is usually that accelerator for growth for most people, right? So that's where I think like I joined because of that. Because I like when I had a conversation with Abhinav and Ankit, this is what
Fantastic. Yeah, I would be sold. Like you rightly said, there are very few companies that are the intersection of both scaling and scale, which is an interesting problem to solve. Why do you think B2B has suddenly gotten traction and people find it interesting? What has changed?
I think it's the first part that I changed, right? So B2B was this sales-driven motion and this marketing motion. So where do marketeers generally market to? They market to the VPs.
Yeah.
So there are like maybe 1-2 million such personas in India or in Asia.
Yeah.
Right? You don't get to see them. And you as a consumer or a person not being a VP or a CXO, you would not see the communication. You don't know why that product is being used.
Mm-hmm.
Now the tone has changed. Now
Yeah.
because B2B products are being built for the end consumer, and you're actually getting to engage it a lot earlier.
Correct.
The recognition is there.
Yeah. Nice.
That delta.
Absolutely. Guys, we're going to open it up for questions. If you have any questions, please send them in the chat box. We'll pick them up as soon as we'll try to get as many questions answered as we can. While we are waiting on the questions, one last question for you is, what is your most favorite thing about Postman?
I would say culture.
Define culture at Postman in 140 words.
140 words. I know
What's special? What is special?
I have this one definition which I like to benchmark myself against, right? If I feel like if I have to wake up every morning and I feel like I want to go to work, right, then it's really good. If there is a period of time, even for like a week, where I am forcing myself to go to work, right, then maybe there's something that I need to rethink, right? Like I'm not either enjoying the people that I'm like working with or the problem that I'm not working with, right? And usually it's the people thing, because problems are not very changing, and like Postman as a company, you know the problem space that is, right? For me, the benchmark is in the last almost 5 years, right? There has not been a single day where I've woken up and I'm like, oh damn, I have to go to work, right? It's always been like I'm super excited to go up.
Yes.
And there have been periods like where I've worked till actually in the early phases when we used to ship, when we were like full small scale startup like 20 people, right? So I used to stay awake till 3-4 and wake up at 9 and go back to work, because I need to go solve this. Like there's this excitement that is there. That hasn't changed in 5 years.
Wow, that's amazing. We have a couple of questions. One is around how do you get a role in the B2B world? Are there any certifications required? Are there are there any prerequisites to join the B2B world?
I don't think so. That's the reason I mentioned about the skill set that is being merging, right? Like now, previously it used to be very different for what a PM for a B2B was needed, and now on the B2C PM, right? This thing has like started to converge a lot more. I think the most important thing is you should be able to convince the B2B or the company that you're trying to approach that this is a problem that you really want to solve. Because like it is not very instinctive to get that answer. Whether if you're trying to solve a problem where you're doing microfinancing to B2B space, or you're building a dev tool, or you're working on some cloud-based solution, right? It is not very instinctive to get it, but you have to be able to pitch that this is a problem that you really, really want to solve.
There's a question from, sorry, you were saying something.
Certifications, I think, are okay. It's helpful in terms of maybe like picking up the skill set. Like I said, the raw skill set is required. That's the only place that certification helps, but specific to any of them, not much.
Makes sense. Ritika has a question. Satisfying the highest paying customers versus keeping eyes on the vision and roadmap, how would you choose?
Yeah, so the interesting bit that I said, like long-term business impact, right? Understanding long-term business impact and having a conviction on that is really important. So even now when we design our roadmap, right, we design it based on how confident we are in terms of it creating long-term business impact, even if it means that we might not satisfy the highest paying segment of customers in the short term, right? So this is really important in the B2B space, because you can always go into this rabbit hole on being a customizer, customized solution for each enterprise, right? Then you eventually start slowing yourself down because you cannot maintain customizability, right? Unless the customization is done by the enterprise themselves, then that's a different thing. But if you are customizing your product for an enterprise and you're shipping it, right, you eventually slow down because there's only a limited amount of mental space that you can have to figure out, okay, there are 100 customers who are customized for this. Then you're like very much screwed. Like most of the B2B spaces that I've operated and spoken to, I've faced this challenge one time or another.
Nice. Yash has an interesting question. He said, I have this problem with my thought process. Postman as a product looks very stable to me and does what it needed almost pretty well. How do I, as a PM, come up with new ideas and features for such a product, especially when the engineering team also has increased multiple times? Sometimes I just feel that whatever features I can think of will not add any incremental value. How do you validate that you are actually adding incremental value? I think is the core of the question.
Yeah, I think this is very interesting from a B2C space that I would take, which is we look at retention cohorts, right? So we specifically look at feature or workflow retention cohorts. So when you say that you come up with an idea and you go and do your research and you have conviction, right? You're like that confidence that this will work, and that confidence comes from talking to people, right? Talking to your users, talking to your teammates, and brainstorming. Once you have this, how do you measure your success? Is usually looking at the cohort of users that are using that feature. Are you increasing the leading indicator is usually retention, so engagement, right? Are people using your feature more and more because you have actually used or shipped this out? If yes, yes. If no, then you'll have to figure it out. Just like very like that.
That's a great answer. Shagun has a related question. How do you figure out leading and lagging metrics for your product?
So I think, so I'll tell one, because there's no clear definition of this, right? The best way to mentally think about this is lagging indicators are the ones that you generally have something called as an outcome. So what you're responsible for an outcome are usually your lagging indicators, right? So let's say if I were to take an example of a company, right? The outcome of any company at the end of the year is what is the revenue that's been generated that year, right? Nothing else, nothing that really matters from a board perspective, or that's a public market. That's a major metric that they look at, right? But when you are actually taking decision on a daily basis as a CEO, right, this is not a metric you should be looking at to go and take a decision of whether something's working or not, because it's already way too late in the cycle to figure out if it's actually working, right? So now most of the board members have moved into this aspect of, okay, let me measure active users and retention and conversion, ARPU, net retention, right? So all of these segments to figure out, okay, if these numbers are generally moving in the right direction, revenue will also move.
Correct.
Right? The interesting bit is, let's say if you take any of these numbers, let's pick up signups, right? So if you take signups are usually assigned as an OKR or an objective or goal for one of the other tools, right? So when they look at this metric, for them, this is a lagging indicator. So they need to take this and figure out what are this input metric which will go ahead and mathematically influence this metric, right? And that becomes their leading indicator. So it is that cascading or trickling down effect that comes in, where you are always thinking about how do I influence my outcome, and I'm confident that I'll reach the outcome if I were to do those set of metrics.
Got it. Sushil has a question. Can you just walk us through how would you decide on what is the feature to build next? Like what kind of research will you undergo? Where do you find these ideas from?
Okay, so I think the more easier one for me to pick up is, let's say if you were to look at a specific domain within Postman, right? So the reason that we gave up this domain is any product manager, designer, or engineers in general will focus on one problem space, whether that space is collaboration or whether that space is notification or that space is, let's say, billing, right? You focus on that one problem space, right? So before anyone even goes ahead and ships a feature, we define what we call as a problem space document or a vision document for that specific domain, right? So that requires a large amount of research to understand, okay, this is a direction, this is the problem that I'm trying to solve, and if I were to solve this problem, this is what I'm going to look at, right? And this is usually mapping for at least a year to 2 years. Now, when you're building the feature, this is usually a translation from how am I influencing or moving towards that direction of the vision. right? So it becomes a lot more easier. Now, like, hey, you know what, this is the overall problem. Now, I think the most important problem that I can see as a signal from the market or from my users is this one. Now, I want to solve this. How do I solve it? You go ahead and have 3 hypotheses on these are the ways that generally it can be solved. You validate with your customers, and then you go ahead and build it out, ship it, measure. If it doesn't work, cancel and go back to the drawing.
Yeah. Shreyas had a question. How do you see growth efforts being done in this space since, you mentioned that experiment may break the experience, but growth efforts revolve around fast rolling and experimentation. So how do you balance these two?
So I'll give you an interesting approach that we do at Postman, right? Like I think so we have a product engineering and design team, right? So that is that one division which purely looks at value creation and engagement, right? So we also have a separate team which is like purely focusing on growth, right? Now, as a business, as a company, you want to enable growth. At the same time, you don't want to break things. Now, how do you do it? Is actually via APIs, right? What we have done is build this nice sandbox areas where the growth team can go ahead and experiment on using the APIs, right? APIs, which the teams generally maintain, right? So the SLA of the product is purely dependent on the SLAs, right? And that's what the product engineering teams always focus on. And we expose the right set of APIs for growth. So when I say right set of APIs, what do they generally experiment on is usually communication. When you're looking at the purchase funnel, maybe the billing pages, right? And the interaction on how certain loops work really well, and then slightly going to tweak them to an extent, right? What growth doesn't focus on and what PMs in Postman are responsible for is engagement and actually building the value. So growth doesn't influence or change anything related to this, which is a core aspect of the product and where the PMs are focusing.
Got it. What is required? This is a popular question many people have asked in a variety of different formats. What is required to be a product manager at Postman as a fresher? Do you hire freshers? Do you hire junior folks? I think you mentioned that you actually prefer hiring as interns and sort of grooming them. So I think part of the question was answered, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yeah, like I think depends for PMs especially, right? I have generally found most of the PMs that we have hired, unless there is a specific skill set that we are looking for, right? So like I said, the domain expertise, right? We have a product manager, one of the heads that we have recently hired, right? That person's been in identity and access management space for the last 20 years. And he's been like leading different companies in the same space. Now that is not something you can acquire. That's not something that you can obviously mentor because that person knows a lot more than me that I can go teach them, right? Now, other aspects of a PM, we look for people who are generally in the early phases, right, where they do not have a concrete bias or what I call a lot of unlearning to do, right? It's usually easier to learn when you don't have to unlearn a lot of things that you have built as a bias over a period of time, right? So that's something that we look for. Unless there's a specific skill that I'm looking for, I don't think we prefer to hire freshers, right? And I think the last year or two we have slowed down in PM hiring because like I think we have expanded to most of the squads. When I joined till about my joining to about 2.5 years, we did hire about I think 6 PMs, out of which 4 of them were freshers.
So you do hire freshers.
Yeah.
Are there specific things that freshers should do to get an interview at Postman? Anything that is a good signal to quantify what their capability is, because they don't have that on their resume.
Yeah, I think more than resumes, like most of the people that I've even freshers that I've eventually spoken to, right, are people who have shown interest. Now, how do you show interest is in varying fashion, right? Like ability to like identify or like showcase that interest, and like that is good indication that like gets you to that conversation, right? And then it depends on the core skill set because you already established the interest piece. Then culture fit and the core skill set is what matters. Correct.
Related question is you said that you guys hire younger talent and you can groom them and so on and so forth. How does what is the technical requirement of this person? Do they have to come from a technical background, or do they just have to have an understanding of the technical space? Like, how much technical understanding is required to be at a company like Postman?
So interestingly, like I think technical being an engineer might sometimes even plays against you, right? I've not been an engineer in a production environment for a long time. So I joined Postman, right? And even like a couple of people who are already PMs at Postman have not been engineers before. Being an engineer obviously gives you a certain amount of advantage because you are able to relate to that persona, right? But the primary thing that I expect every PM to have is tremendous amount of interest in the problem space, right? That is like similar to you joining any company. Forget Postman. If you're joining a banking division, if you're joining travel, if you're trying to airlines, whatever, right? If you do not spend time in understanding the people who are going to use your product, right, you should generally not be in that space. That will not give you happiness, or it will not give you success, right? So that is very critical. Like whether you're technically super great, right, that's not essential, but do you have passion to solve the problem is super critical. But I can't emphasize enough. Like I think because you have to put that extra mile.
Correct.
Uh,
Like you said, for you, culture is waking up every day and being excited about solving it, right?
Yeah.
Directly proportional to how interested you are in the problem. Does that get you excited to wake up every day?
Yeah.
One question, again, very popular. People have asked in a variety of different formats, but the core question is, how do you go about prioritization of features at Postman? Is there a framework that you've designed specific to your use case or customers on identifying where to focus your energy?
The most interesting bit is the way that we decide is we don't want to build features.
Sorry, repeat that last bit again.
We don't want to build features.
You don't want to build features.
Now, there's a reason for that. So, like I said, the most important thing in the beginning, right? Like developers are people that usually are very hard to
sell
get from and then sell for, right? Now, if you build one really bloated product, if you build a product just sluggish and feeling, right? Usually the features are the ones that are generally going towards. Right? So the essence of building good product at Postman and like PMs that we force for is, I don't use the term features at all. We talk about what are the improvements that you're going to do to the product, right? It could be a feature, right? But you have to justify why this improvement or the specification is actually going to solve a problem for the end user. And that's the reason you need to build it, right? Otherwise, you'll always have this catalog of features, obviously linked. There's a bunch of list of features, and then you can prioritize using this 100 different frameworks that come up with, right? It is all about understanding what are you trying to improve and going ahead and seeing if it fits to the vision and does it have enough of a use case for your users to be happy about. If you can't get that right, and you're not sure about it, we don't even ship it. Like there are times where we have built something, we demoed it to our first, we have this internal demo day that happens every other week, right? We see it in a demo day, and if you feel we are not confident in the feature and it doesn't actually solve a use case, we even pull it back out, right? Ideally, let us say like we have this different set of demos for designing, prototyping, then you build it out, see it on beta, then ship it to production, right? So we are like, I don't want people to build features at Postman, as that's not the primary objective of any PM. Your objective is to build a better product every week.
Yeah, I think the core difference that I want to maybe re-articulate is I think in the B2C world, the PM is responsible, thinks about everything from growth to engagement to revenue. I think in the B2B world, at least in the Postman world, it feels like revenue is somebody else's responsibility. Growth is just product led. And that product led comes from the engagement piece, which is where the PM spend most of their time. And hence, it's less about whether that engagement is driven through a feature or is driven through content or is driven through a better UI or an experience, whatever that may be. But core goal is just getting that engagement right.
Yeah. The only is I think revenue, even though a product manager is not responsible for revenue, right? A product manager is responsible for building higher willingness to pay, right? That is what I call as value creation bit, right? So every PM is responsible for creating a more valuable product, right? Sometimes the product being performant is more valuable than what it was not before, right? People are willing to pay. Like, why do you pay more for a Mac machine versus a Dell laptop?
Correct. Absolutely. One last question, and then I think we'll wrap up this session. Why is building new features critical when there are millions of users already using your current product, and seems like you don't really have many competitors as such?
Okay. I'll give a very simple example. Maybe like 12 years ago, 14 years ago, right? If a Nokia phone was one of the phones which were super popular, it had 90% of the market share, 90 plus market share. Now no one knows where Nokia phones are, right? So that is the reason that you continuously iterate on the product, right?
Yes.
It's really important to get to the top, right? And it's really hard to get to the top. It's harder to maintain that space. That is the reason you continuously iterate on and like add value. Right. So that is the parallel I always try to use.
Amen. On that note, thank you everyone for joining in. Great last words to live by. Never stop innovating, I think. Also, I think the point Preetam was saying, one is you make X dollars from a user. How do you continue to extend that ARPU, right? It's only when you keep adding more value to that same consumer. So thanks so much, Preetam. Thanks for joining us. Lovely session. I definitely learned a lot. We'll have this recording on YouTube if you guys want to revisit it. I'd definitely be revisiting. And if you have any questions, you can follow him on Twitter, ask there, or write to us at Upraised. We'll try to get these questions answered. But thank you so much for joining in. We'll have our next session. Stay tuned. We'll keep you updated in a couple of weeks. We have an exciting next session coming up.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Preetam. Have a good evening. Have a good weekend, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.